Hey guys, so as you guys know, did a parenting series in January, and now doing a marriage series here in February. And like I did with the parenting series, I'm also having the same struggle with the marriage series. Do I end it in February or keep going? Um, the good news is this is the last Wednesday in February. The bad news is I have to decide by the next Wednesday. But today we're going to look at the book of Ruth and the whole book of Ruth. I won't read it all, but we're going to do some selective readings, tell the story of Ruth, and we're going to draw out some wisdom, some understanding, some insight about marriage and how God is working behind the scenes, which I actually don't think is behind the scenes. God's working in ways we often don't recognize. Why did I do that? As I said up front, we've noticed a lot of statistics about marriage and whose marriages are surviving, and there is definitely, the statistics say, people who have, people of faith, are weathering the pressures of the pandemic and the paranoia about the pandemic. They're weathering it a lot better. But I'm of this school of thought, especially when I counsel people in premarital preparations, that you should always be working on your marriage. You shouldn't just let it exist. The man should always be pursuing his wife. The woman should always be looking how to be a partner to the man. We should always be looking to understand one another as individuals. We should always be growing together in our relationship with the Lord, tackling life's problems together, being students and stewards together. We should always be working on our marriage. Well, when your whole groove of how you relate to family and life and schedule and stuff has been thrown askew, and the pressures that we've been dealing with because of the pandemic and the paranoia over the pandemics, when that's stewed together, it becomes increasingly more important to actually work on our marriage. But what I find really encouraging is that God's working on my marriage. God is working on my marriage oftentimes in ways that I can't even imagine. Now somebody's tuning in and they're single and they're like, "Oh man, here's a preacher talking about marriage again." Well, you may be single for a season, and that you long for marriage. You may be called to singleness, and you think it's going to last your whole life, and you might not know it could just be a season. But either way, the same counsel is true about even our friendships, the things going on in our family. And I think it's important sometimes to just back up and look at the truth that we're the ones that are often in a huge rush to exert our will, and God is working to work His will out, and we just need to see that. So we're going to take a look at the book of Ruth today. Let me open with a word of prayer, and then let's dive in, because I am absolutely going to do an overview of the whole book of Ruth. Let's pray. God, thank you for some time together in your word. Thank you that we have the marvel of technology to do this. Lord, I do humbly ask you to get this video right to the people who need it. And then, Lord, send it to some folks who don't want it but need it. Pray you cause your people to spend time in your word. I pray this overview prompts many people to individual study of the book of Ruth. More than anything, God, I pray you show up and speak to our hearts, and that we know it is you speaking to us, and we receive it and we believe it. In Jesus we pray. Amen. Now, a little bit of a personal testimony. The book of Ruth had such an impact on me in the years even before I was married, and Karen and I and some friends studied through the book of Ruth together back in the 90s, and it had such an impact on me that when our first daughter was born, her name is Katie Ruth, for the reason of how the book of Ruth and the life of Ruth so impacted me. The book's got a lot of purposes. and there's debate about which purposes are the highest or the most important. I'll tell you what encouraged me the most when I read the book of Ruth. What encouraged me the most was how Boaz worked as a kinsman redeemer, and I saw how Christ had worked as a kinsman redeemer in my life and had brought me into the covenant relationship of God, even though I was a foreigner to it. I didn't grow up in the faith. I didn't grow up in the church. I didn't grow up walking with Jesus. It wasn't my heritage. I did not belong, but Jesus added me to the family. He added me to his bride, and that story touched me in the book of Ruth. And then the secondary thing was how I saw how Ruth became a person who not only was she a foreigner, but the ways and things of God were foreign to her. But out of I believe God called this woman, and in her integrity, she learned how to do every little thing like it mattered. And that's what I really want to do. I want to do every little thing like it mattered. And so just became an important book, and it remains an important book in my life. For today's purposes, however, though, I want to concentrate on particularly the relationship Ruth had with her husband, Boaz. So let me spend the first few moments just telling the story. Let me set the stage by reading Ruth chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Wow, that's a lot of information in 5 short verses. When does the book happen? In the time of the judges. What was going on in the time of judges? The nation would wax and wane, and they'd get away from God, and God would raise up a judge and would work in their midst and get them pointed back to looking toward the Lord. And sometimes the way God would get their attention was through various trials, such as a famine. During one of these famines, Elimelech, whose name means God is king, isn't that an interesting name? Elimelech and his wife Naomi, means beautiful, take their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. What's crazy to me is these boys' names mean sickly and puny. They take their 2 sons, and they're living in. It's like saying you're living in Prospect Hill, North Carolina, USA. They're living in Bethlehem, Judah, Israel. Bethlehem of Judah. And what does Bethlehem mean? It means God's house of bread. And what's Judah mean? Judah means praise. So it's like saying they left God's house of bread and praise. They left there because of a famine. I always like this little detail of the story. It just sounds, it makes the story come alive to me. So you got God is my king with his beautiful wife and their 2 sons, sickly and puny, leaving God's house of bread and praise. Where do they go? They go to Moab. Now in Psalm 68, God calls Moab his washpot. That's apparently what God thought of Moab in those days. That's interesting, right? So they take their family over into Moab. Excuse me. And they're there for a while, apparently, and Elimelech dies. And so there's Naomi with her 2 boys, and then they marry Moabite women, which, if you are at all acquainted with, the Jewish law, they weren't supposed to do that, but they did. And they married Orpah and Ruth. Now, we know Orpah means deer. And I don't know if we knew. Well, I know what research says. The common thought is they didn't exactly know what Ruth meant from the Moabite people. They didn't exactly know, but it came to mean grace. But so you got dear and grace, right? And then they lived there, mama, 2 sons, 2 daughter-in-laws. The Bible says they lived there about 10 years. And then and Mahlon and Chilion die. So now you're left with Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law. And they've left God's house of bread and praise and moved over here to God's washpot and lived there a while. And God is my king dies, and beautiful lady is left there with sickly and puny, who marry dear and grace, and they live together for a few years, and sickly and puny die. So we're left with beautiful and dear and grace. Well, Naomi says, I got to get up out of here. That is a very loose paraphrase of Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. It reads like this: Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and gave them food. She says, man, I got to get out of here. And in Ruth chapter 1, verse 8, she tells these daughters-in-law, she says, now listen, y'all need to go on back home to y'all's mama's house. And I pray that the Lord deals kindly with you as you have dealt with me. That's a real interesting detail. They've had a good relationship together. She says, I want y'all to experience the Lord's goodness. Y'all have been kind to me. She kissed them, and the 2 girls says, and this is Ruth chapter 1, verse 10, says, no, we're going with you. They started singing that song, We Are Family. Said, we can't do it. And so Naomi's go, no, y'all don't do this. Y'all, this is Tim's paraphrase, Ruth chapter 1, verse 11. Naomi says, no, don't do that. Don't do that. She says, have I yet sons in my womb? And she's talking about the Jewish law here. The Jewish law would say, if these women die without a child, then the brother of their dead husband is to marry them and have children together, and or at least a child together. She says, so I don't have any more sons for y'all. Both of my sons are dead. There's no hope that you guys can obey our law, can do what God has said to do. Says, so she tells him, says, go back to your mama, and even if I could have some more sons, I mean, it's gonna be a long time before they're grown. She's like, you guys better go back to your people so you can build a future. Orpah's like, deuces. I joke sometimes, say this was Oprah Winfrey's great grandma. Orpah, it tells us in Ruth chapter 1, verse 14, then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, which means she was saying like, adios. And Ruth clung to her. So Orpah goes. The deer has run off. The deer has run off. And again, in verse 15, Ruth 1:15, Naomi urges Ruth. So listen, see your sister-in-law, she's gone now. You just need to go too. And Ruth gives this beautiful promise, beautiful proclamation in a few verses here in Ruth 1. Listen to what she says, Ruth 1:16 through 18. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And verse 18 says, when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Here what you have is a woman who is entering covenant agreement to walk with her mother-in-law. So they go back to where they were originally from, and when she's coming back, people recognize it. The Bible says the whole town was stirred up. And they go, hey, Naomi's back. She says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitter. She's like, don't call me beautiful, call me bitter. And so there they live. Now, I didn't create the terms. Don't be mad at me. But in those days, if you didn't have a trade or a farm, and sometimes both, you lived, you did your business, and you did your groceries out of your own house. You didn't drive off to some city somewhere and earn a living and then drive back home and spend the living you earned. Everything was at your house. And if you were a woman, there wasn't much employment. You could become a servant. You could become indentured into someone. We all know that as long as sin has existed, there's been the opportunity for people to earn unjust gain through various means. But Naomi comes back, and it is the promise. And this is part of what she was trying to warn those girls about. It wasn't just not having a husband. She didn't have a husband. It was the promise of a difficult life. And when Ruth says, I'm going with you no matter what, Ruth is embracing this difficult life. And so what could they expect to do? They could expect to come back, and if they were willing to work, they could expect to, there's provision in the Mosaic law for them to find food. If you whatever kind of thing you was farming, you're actually commanded in Scripture to not pick it all, but to leave some for people who are struggling. They had a welfare system written right into the law, woven into the fabric of the culture. And so here's Naomi saying, all right, now here's how things work. She explains it to her in the first few verses of Ruth chapter 2. She says, listen, this is what you do. They're out there reaping the crops right now. You go along behind them, and what they leave, you can pick from the leftovers. It's called gleaning. Well, then she notices this guy named Boaz. So let's halt and talk a little bit about Boaz's story. She notices this guy named Boaz, and she's like, hey, that's my kinfolk right yonder. My kinfolk is Boaz. Now, let's stop and recognize something about Boaz. Talked about this back during Christmas. I don't know if anybody remembers, but I definitely remember. Let's talk about Boaz, but to do that, let's go to Matthew chapter 1. Okay? In Matthew chapter 1 and verse 5, we get a very interesting detail. And Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab. Where's that name from? Rahab was the prostitute who lived in Jericho who helped the spies. So here they are, they're moved back. Naomi is downloading the system of how the culture works to Ruth. And Naomi goes, wait, that's Boaz. That's one of my cousins. She's like, go pick in his field. You might even could say if there's someone who has been, who's been taught to treat people well, it'd probably be Boaz. And so she does. And, here's what we know about Boaz. We know his heritage, but we also know that Boaz was an honorable man. You get that in several indications throughout the book. And in Ruth chapter 2, verse 20, when Naomi and Ruth are talking about Boaz, she says, this man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Now, within the law, there's this system of how families can take care of each other. And I won't get into all that, but God had put a system in place that if people would just take God at his word, believe God for his promises. Now, this is a big hint right here. If they take God at his word and believe him for his promises, he had made a system where they could take care of each other. Okay? So she says, look, you just keep going to his field. You know, he'll take care of us. He's one of our distant cousins. You know, he won't let anything happen to us. Or happen to you out there in the fields. So then we take another level. Naomi basically, says, oh, he's noticed you. He's noticed you as an individual. Okay, great. Here's what I want you to do. And then chapter 3 is all about the instructions and the outworking of the instructions. He basically says, I want you to go and meet Boaz in a very particular and personal way so that he knows that you care for him and that you could picture a future with him. It's a very strange story. She goes and lays down at a man's feet and all this stuff. But when she lays down at his feet, he understands that she is saying, I submit myself to your leadership if you will redeem our family. If you will get us out of this mess we in and bring us under your care. Well, I love Ruth chapter 3, verse 11. It starts at verse 10. It says, "This is Boaz speaking. May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after other young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." Now you see this. This is a little detail. Boaz is saying, listen, everybody recognizes that you've been acting honorably. You've been acting godly. She hadn't been taking shortcuts. She had been doing, even as a foreigner, she had been doing right. Okay? So you get to verse 12. "And now it is true that I am a redeemer." Okay? "Yet there's a redeemer nearer than I." Just to illustrate, it's like, yeah, I'm the 8th cousin, but we got a 6th cousin. Or I'm the 3rd cousin, but there's a 2nd cousin. And the way our rules work, I got to check with these 2nd cousins. Okay? Verse 13, "Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down till the morning." So he tells us, relax. I'm willing. I got to find out if he's willing, because he, as a closer kinsman, has a more right. Is he willing to do what it takes to take on the responsibility to marry you? All right. So the next day, and now we're in chapter 4. Okay. Well, we see that he goes down to the city gate. Now, this sounds like a strange scene to us, but that's where the elders sat. That's where the action happens. You might say this was the city council, and this was the mayor and the city council, and this was the city planner and the city manager. All the elders of the city. He goes down here, and he talks to this closer kinsman and says, "Hey, here's the situation with our relative Naomi and this Moabite daughter-in-law of hers. Do you want to redeem her?" That's what he asked in Ruth chapter 4, verse 4. And the man initially says, "Yeah, I'll redeem it." Then he says this, verse 5, "Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of his dead inheritance." In other words, you're not just getting their allotment of land. You got to take care of the mom, and you got to marry the woman, and y'all got to have kids together. Now, I love Ruth chapter 4, verse 6. It just makes me laugh. The man says, "Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." He says, "Oh, I got to marry her? No, I can't do that." He said, Hey, would you like this land? Yeah, I'd love that land. Already comes with a brand new a mother-in-law and a new wife, and yeah. And so he understood that the closer kinsman says, wait, if I do this, then I don't keep the land, and my present family doesn't keep the land. The family that I'll raise, that I'm commanded to have with this Moabite woman, they'll get the land. He said, no, I ain't playing that. The letter of the law was too much for him. He could not bear up under the letter of the law. All right. So he says, you go ahead. He said, you can get that deal. Get that land, get that woman. And then Boaz turns his attention to doing the legal aspects. In other words, he's a man of honor himself. He's known, you read his story in Ruth chapter 2. He is known to be a mighty man of valor. He is known to be a noble man. So he does what is right in claiming that not only is he saying, yeah, I'll take the land according to the Mosaic law, but I'll take the new mother-in-law. I'll take the new wife. And in other words, I'll bind up all of my present with her right now so that whatever happens in the future, I'll accept that too. And now they get married. Verse 13. Ruth chapter 4, verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And guess what? They have a son. Isn't that awesome? They have a son. And what's interesting about this son is, I'll cut to the chase. The name of this son is Obed. Anybody know that name? Obed fathered Jesse. Anybody know that name? Jesse fathered David and a whole bunch of other boys too. Isn't this interesting? Salmon married Rahab, a foreign woman. They have Boaz. Boaz marries another foreign woman. See how grace was built into, I believe grace was built into his experience. Boaz marries Ruth, and they have a kid named Obed. Obed fathers Jesse. Jesse fathers David. David becomes king. Wow. Right? Second king of Israel, behind King Saul. Isn't that interesting, right? And all of that story, you go back to that moment. You go back to that moment where a story that started kind of ugly, with the people of God, brings Ruth into the people of God. And Ruth begins to walk with integrity. Ruth begins to walk with faith. Ruth begins to walk with honesty. And she literally puts her trust in the Lord. Now, what's funny is I've used 28 minutes to introduce the lessons we have for today. So what can we learn ourselves today? That's the whole story of Ruth. I don't know about happily ever after, but I do know this much. That Naomi hung around, and she was a good grandmother to the child. She took the child and laid him in her lap. And the Bible tells us in Ruth chapter 4, verse 16, that she became his nurse. Isn't that a beautiful story? She had lost her husband Elimelech. She had lost her sons Mahlon and Chilion, and now she was being a nurse to her grandchild. And that's a fancy way of saying she helped raise that boy. And his name was Obed. And that was Jesse's granddaddy. Granddaddy Obed. When he got old, they said, what's he doing? Obed's laying in the old bed. But what can we learn in our modern day about all of this? Okay, I think there's some incredible lessons from Ruth as an individual and Boaz as an individual that are sort of blend. Both of these people wanted to know what was right, and when they knew what was right, they wanted to do what was right. In Ruth's case, she started behind the 8 ball. She was a Moabite. She didn't know about their ways, and she said, "I'm going to stick with my mother-in-law. I'm going to stick with my my mother-in-law's God, and I am going to discover this way of life. And as I discover it, I'm going to do it. Okay? Flip that around. Boaz knew this stuff, and he says, hey, I am going to go by our rules, our laws, our morals, our values. I'm going to do what's right. So Ruth would discover it and do it. Boaz would recall it and do it. Now there's a lesson. What are you doing right now in your marriage? Do you need to discover what's right in some areas? Well, discover it and do it. Do you already know? Put it into practice. Live with integrity. How do we handle difficult situations? We keep on doing what's right. Keep on doing what God has told us to do. Keep on handling life situations the way God would want us to handle them. Not just by the letter of the law, but also with the spirit of the law. Second huge lesson is not being in a rush when things are really messed up. I think Naomi was learning that lesson the very hard way. You remember she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. I'm bitter. I don't like how the Lord has dealt with me. But over time, she sees how it works out. Well, Ruth was living in discovery. And both of them were learning to wait on God. They were learning to wait for God to work things out. God is just not in the same rush that we always are in. That's just a fact. He knows he has all of eternity to do his will, and he's gonna use it all up, every bit of eternity. Use up all of it. And sometimes in our life, we feel like this is never going to work out. Well, Ruth and Naomi's story together works out over the course of years. I mean, years. They tell us in Ruth chapter 1 and verse number 5, excuse me, the last part of verse number 4. They lived there about 10 years. This is after they got married. After Orpah and Ruth married Mahlon and Chilion. They were there about 10 years. That was 10 years in forming a family together. And then it doesn't tell us how long they lived there after those boys died, but it was some time. And it doesn't tell us exactly the time frame of getting back into Judah and Ruth getting the pace and requirement of life there. It just doesn't tell us how long that is. But if it was only one growing season, it's 11 years, or 10 and a half years. My point is a lot of times we get our nerves tore up when something doesn't work out in a week or a month. Whew. This lady has a minimum decade. Minimum. Hello. And if you want to be technical, let's say it was only 10 years. Let's say it was only 10 years and half of a growing season. 10 and a half years. Let's say it's 10 years in a growing season, and immediately they get married and get, conceive a child on day one of their honeymoon. 10 years, 6 months, 9 months. Let's just say it was only 11 years and 3 months. They're sitting there holding a baby. I got a feeling it was more than that. I'll call it a even dozen. Let's say it's at least 12 years. 12 years of waiting on God. And that whole time, let's look at the three main characters of the story. Think about it. Naomi turns to bitter before she realizes she's blessed. Ruth has to learn to walk with God over that time. And Boaz has been faithfully living and running his farm, being a good citizen, and walking in the Word, so that when the moment comes, where even in Naomi's bitterness, she instructs Ruth. When Ruth obeys, all the elements that made Boaz a notable and worthy man had been brewing together for all those years so that he was ready for that moment. Now why do I say that is, a lot of times, we go crazy when something don't work out in a few days. Well, look at your marriage. Hang in there. Understand that God's pace and yours isn't always the same, right? And then start to ask yourself, while I'm waiting on God, am I walking with integrity? Am I walking with obedience? Am I trying to grow? Am I meeting God in the waiting? Am I participating and allowing God to help me grow in the waiting? Thirdly, not only have integrity, but do what's right. Do what's right. Do the right thing over and over and over and over and over again. Waiting is not passive. Waiting is saying, I will not take a shortcut. I will not do something evil or wrong. I will hold on for God. And while I'm holding on, I'm going to do every right thing I can imagine to do. Now, a lot of times we want our marriages to get worked out, but or to grow or to get better or whatever it is you want for your marriage. But a lot of times we ain't interested in that do right part. Say, I'll do right when they do right. No, we do right because God's told us to do right. If you ain't on the same page with your spouse, start by seeing if you're on the same page with the Lord yourself. Are you humble? Are you adopting the right role that you have in life as a man or a woman, a husband, a wife, a mom, a dad, a son, a daughter? Are you living into the roles? Do you serve? Are you a witness for Jesus? We start taking care of those things, right? And we lead into and live into those things and watch what God does in our lives. And I think that's a huge lesson from Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. And I think it's an important lesson right now because a lot of us, we're tried. This pandemic has tried our nerves. We've spent more time with our families than we were prepared to. And the question isn't like, do you spend time? Is what do we do with that time? And then lastly, a lot of times I think we spend a lot of our prayer lives begging God to do what we want him to do. And I think it's real interesting to see that God is always working. He had been crafting this man Boaz before Naomi and Ruth ever knew him. He had been shaping Naomi for her whole life. He had been shaping her. When Naomi's heart was crushed and she wasn't thinking right, God didn't give up on her either. And it took a lot of years of preparation for the moments of fulfillment to come to fruition. The moment when Naomi has the right advice to give, Ruth has the right spirit to receive it, she does it. Boaz has the right spirit to receive what Ruth does. It took a lot of prep by God and God alone to get them ready for that moment. Okay? And sort of the question I ask myself a lot of times is, I know God is working. Am I working? I know God is doing things I can't comprehend, but am I trying to grow? Am I positioning myself for obedience? Now, why do I call the story of Ruth, or why do I recall the story of Ruth for this marriage series? Because look at the whole story. It was for the telling of the story was short, right? The telling of the story was short. The living of the story was long. The longer part of living, Ruth and Boaz didn't even know of each other, right? So for all those years, they didn't know each other. And then they get to know each other very quickly. Very quickly. What's my point is God was working that whole entire time. And he's working right now in your life. God is working. He is working. All things work together for good for those that love the Lord and are called according to his purposes, that we might be formed to the image of his beloved Son. God is working. And what's he working? He's working to make us like his Son. He's working to prepare us for good works. And he is working for us to learn to walk together in friendships and relationships. God is working. And we don't mind saying, hey, God, work in this way. God's going, no, I'm working. The question is, can you receive my work? That's why Ruth is such a beautiful picture. She says, I ain't going nowhere. I'm staying with you. Wherever you live, that's going to be my home. Whoever your people is, those are going to be my people. Your God's going to be my God. When I die, they're going to bury me in the same. When you die, they're going to bury you. And when I die, they're going to bury me in the same graveyard. That's commitment. And that's saying I submit myself to God and I submit myself to you. And I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to trust God to work all this out. I think it's a huge idea about marriage. I submit myself to God. I submit myself to you. And I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to trust God to work this out. Ruth has been a great encouragement to me. I pray it's been a small encouragement to you. Peace.